Okay, this video is on chapter 16, the lymphatic system. I will do a separate video on immunity. Okay, so the lymphatic system is very similar to the cardiovascular system, and it works with the cardiovascular system. What I mean by this is that the lymphatic system is also made up of vessels that are transporting fluids, and the fluids actually come from the same sources. So the lymphatic fluid is also a watery fluid that is being transported from different areas all over the body. And it actually gets emptied back into the cardiovascular system. So there's three different functions of the lymphatic system. So first of all, transporting fluids. And transporting fluids, the direction of the transport is going to be away from the tissues and back to the cardiovascular system. It also works with the digestive system in absorbing lipids. And there's specialized lymphatic capillaries in the digestive system, which are called lacteals. Then we also have the function where it's going to be working with your immune system, which is really together with the lymphatic system, but we'll kind of separate it out here in this PowerPoint. So it's going to be defending against pathogens. All right, so let's look at the lymphatic vessels and how that transport occurs. So lymphatic vessels are, as we said, they're similar to cardiovascular veins. And the similarity is not only that they are composed of the same type of tissue, which ask yourself, what type of tissue are capillaries composed of? Give me a second. And that would be simple squamous epithelium. So they're composed of that same type of tissue. They have some of the same layering. They do not have a thick muscular layer like we see in the cardiovascular system, but they do have valves like veins do. So we have the lymphatic capillaries, which are going to be taking up fluids, and as we said, a watery fluid. When the fluid is in the tissues, it is called interstitial fluid. And let's remember where this fluid comes from. The fluid originates from the cardiovascular system. So the fluid within the blood, of course, is called the plasma, right? So the plasma is going to leave the cardiovascular system by osmosis, and we have diffusion as well with dissolved substances that are leaving. And once it leaves the vessels of the cardiovascular system, it becomes interstitial fluid. Then the interstitial fluid is going to be taken up by the lymphatic capillaries. And at that point, it becomes lymph. So then the lymph gets transported through the lymphatic capillaries, through the lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes, and then it gets emptied back into the cardiovascular system. And we can see this occurring here. This is the subclavian vein here, where it's going to be emptied back into the cardiovascular system. All right, so our lymphatic pathways, we mentioned the capillaries, the lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes. Then we have larger lymphatic vessels. And then we have even larger vessels, which we call the lymphatic trunks, which lead into larger vessels called the lymphatic collecting ducts. And then eventually, as we said, into the subclavian veins of the thorax. Right, so here we have a close-up of the blood capillary with a lymphatic capillary, which is intertwined We can see the difference here, that the lymphatic capillary is not connected. So it's a closed in capillary that's not connected to another vessel. It is kind of intertwined with the cardiovascular capillaries, but they're not actually connected there. So the fluid, as we said, it's going to leave cardiovascular. It's going to go from the plasma into the tissues where it becomes interstitial fluid. And then the interstitial fluid gets taken back up by forces like osmosis and hydrostatic pressure into the lymphatic capillaries and then transporting back towards the venous system. Right, so we mentioned that they are similar. They do have the epithelial lining, the smooth muscle with elastic fibers and connective tissue. But as we said, it does not have the thick, smooth muscle. And they do contain valves. So just like we saw in the veins, the lymphatic vessels contain valves. And we know that valves prevent backflow, right? So valves prevent backflow, which is going to keep the fluid moving in one direction. We mentioned with the cardiovascular system that the venous blood is going to be transported back towards the heart, and mostly due to the movement of skeletal muscles and breathing movements. The lymphatic vessels are working in the same way. So as the fluid passes valve, it's not able to go back in the other direction. And so then those muscular movements, any movements that would squeeze on the vessel would cause the fluid to continue in one direction. Okay, so here we have a diagram that shows the lymphatic trunks and collecting ducts, and we can see if we start with the feet, we see those vessels all the way down. The fluid's going to be going up towards the thighs and then up into the trunk and going into through the lymph nodes. So in the groin area, we have the inguinal lymph nodes there. And we'll talk about what lymph nodes do in just a second. And then traveling into the trunks and the ducts, and then back towards the subclavian vein. Right, so if we look here of the differences between the right and the left sides of the body. So we see here that on the right side, we have the arm and the head, the right side of the head, and the chest area of the right side of the body, which is going to be drained by the right lymphatic duct and go into the subclavian vein. On the left side of the body, however, we have the fluid which is coming up from the lower part of the body, is going through the lymphatic trunk and the thoracic duct and going up and being emptied into the left subclavian vein. So here we can see that flow chart showing the different vessels as it's heading back towards the subclavian veins. All right, so I want to talk about this uptake of fluid. Now, we know that if fluid accumulates in the tissues, then it causes edema. So edema is another term for swelling. So to maintain the fluid concentration of the blood, we talked about plasma proteins being kept within the blood to maintain that plasma concentration. So it pulls the water back in to the blood into the plasma. We do have some fluids that are not going to be pulled back in. And as we said, that would become our interstitial fluid. Then we have the fluid movement into the lymphatic vessels. So again, we have this passive movement of fluids into the vessel, and this is occurring by that inward forces, much like we saw with plasma moving back into the cardiovascular system. Okay, we have mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, which we call MALT. This is encapsulated lymphatic tissue in the digestive system, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. So this is pulling in those fluids and helping to send the fluids through the lymphatic nodules, such as the tonsils and the appendix, and through the Peyer's patches, which are going to help to get rid of pathogens that could have entered through those different areas. So if you look at what do these different systems have in common, digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts, what do they all have in common? Well, they have in common that they are mucosa, for one, and number two, that those different systems are open by tubes to the outside. So you think about that for a second: digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive, how they are open to the outside. So this opens up those systems to potential pathogens. And so we have our lymphocytes and our macrophages, which are going to be helping to destroy the pathogens that may be able to get in to those different systems. All right, so let's talk about some of our lymphatic organs. We have the lymph nodes, and lymph nodes contain cells that are macrophages that are going to be in there destroying foreign substances, getting rid of debris. And I've used this term pathogen, and by pathogen, I mean that this could be any substance that could potentially cause harm to the body. So we have things like viruses, bacteria, we have parasites, we have other harmful substances that could hurt the body. So the term pathogen, just think of anything that could invade or hurt the body. Right, so we have different locations of these lymph nodes that contain the macrophages that are in there working to get rid of those pathogens. And let's take a look at the structure of the lymph node. Here we have the lymphatic vessels attached to a lymph node. We've got the cardiovascular system that is weaving around the area. And here's a drawing representation of the lymph node. We can see that we have afferent lymphatic vessels here that are coming into the node, and then we have efferent lymphatic vessels that are leaving. Notice here that we've got 4 coming in and 2 leaving. So think about what this would do to the flow through the lymph node. If you have 4 sources coming in and only 2 leaving, right, that's going to slow it down, and that's going to cause those fluids to mix around within the lymph node and be more likely to come in contact with the macrophages and the T cells that are going to be within those nodules in the lymph nodes. Here we have a slide. So I think if you'll refer to your lab book, you would need to draw a slide of the lymph node. This is exercise 49. So make sure that you answer those questions and draw that slide for your lab work. All right, so here we have locations of the lymph nodes. And let's start towards the head. We have the cervical lymph nodes. Cervical means the neck, right? So the cervical lymph nodes are in the neck area. We've used the term axillary before. And so remember, axillary means in the armpits. If you continue on down, we have the supratrochlear lymph node, and that would be there. Remember the trochlear notch and the trochlea of the elbow. So that would be within that elbow area. Continuing on, we have abdominal lymph nodes in the abdominal cavity. We have pelvic lymph nodes in the pelvic cavity, and then we have inguinal lymph nodes in the groin area. So again, these lymph nodes are going to take in the lymph, circulate it around, and help to deal with the pathogens that may have entered into the body. Okay, so we mentioned filtering the harmful particles as one of the functions. We also have immune surveillance. So monitoring the body fluids. This can help to set into action other things that can help to keep the body from getting sick, right? To help to deal with the pathogen depending on what type it is. Right, here's a clinical application on lymphedema, which is the accumulation of fluid or edema in a particular area. And this can occur when lymph nodes are removed or blocked due to some medical reason. So things that can be done to help to combat this would be exercising, because again, that movement helps to move the fluid around and push it back towards the cardiovascular system. Also, wearing compression sleeves or compression socks that can help to keep the fluid from accumulating in those tissues, and using a compression pump that can also help to drain the fluid. Right, our next organ of the lymphatic system is the thymus. And the thymus, you might remember seeing that on a couple of the models that we have in the lab. Now, the thymus is not found on all of our models and torsos in the lab, and that is because the thymus does what as you age, right? It actually gets smaller. So it's very large in infants and children. And then as you have developed your immune system and you start to get older, it is going to begin shrinking. So it starts shrinking during puberty. And in elderly people, it is completely replaced by almost like scar tissue, adipose and connective tissue. So if we think about what happens as we develop our immunity, we're being exposed to pathogens and our body is figuring out how to deal with those pathogens. And you may remember from COVID, or also other examples like the flu and pneumonia and things like that, where elderly people are at greater risk of mortality from those different illnesses than young people are. And the thymus plays a role in that, because if you're exposed to something later in life, your immune system has a harder time dealing with it because the thymus is not there to provide its services in developing that immunity to that particular pathogen. Right, so here we can see the thymus in this diagram is this small area here. It is anterior to the heart. So it's right there, it's going to be, and a lot of people confuse the thymus and the thyroid gland. So remember, the thyroid gland is part of the endocrine system. It is anterior to the thymus. It is wrapped around the trachea and parts of the larynx, but the thymus is below that. So the thymus is inferior to the thyroid gland, and it's found in the mediastinum. So right there with the heart in the middle of the thoracic cavity. The structure of the thymus is very similar to the structure of a lymph node. And so let me go back for just a second. Oop. And here we can see the structure of the thymus. So it has a similar appearance to that of the lymph node with these nodules. It does, however, have these deeper lobes within the thymus than you see in the lymph node. All right, so here we have in a fetus and here in an adult. This process is called involution. So as we have it getting smaller, the older you get, that's called involution. Next, we have our spleen. And the spleen is the largest major lymphatic organ. It is involved heavily with the cardiovascular system because it contains sinuses that are filled with blood. And so it provides a reservoir for blood. And one thing that it does is it filters the red blood cells. So remember that red blood cells are only going to last about 120 days in circulation. So after they're produced in the red bone marrow, the red blood cells, or the erythrocytes, are going to go into the blood. They're going to circulate and do their job for 120 days. And then as they start to get worn out, they're going to be filtered through the spleen and eventually broken down. So the red pulp of the spleen contains macrophages that are going to be helping to engulf those red blood cells, break down the parts. Remember, we talked about how different parts of the red blood cell are going to be recycled and parts are going to be disposed of. The white pulp of the spleen contains lymphocytes. So think about white blood cells, white pulp, and also macrophages, which are going to have that function of getting rid of pathogens and defending against infection. Here we have the slide of the spleen, and we can see again that it kind of has that similar appearance. We have the red pulp around and then the white pulp in these areas here. It has a capsule that covers everything. We have a great blood supply, and remember the splenic artery and the splenic vein, which we saw when we were studying the cardiovascular system. So remember, delivering the blood through the organ, and then within the spleen, the different areas, the white and the red pulp, are going to have their lymphatic function within. So here's a great table to help you to organize this information, to help you to study for your quiz. And we will end there. Our next video will be on immunity, and this video will continue on with the chapter.